today I'm going to show you how I oil finish my competition guns. This is finished birch laminate and it's a 3-piece grip set to suit the Aeron ACZ chassis with an HFT 500 action fitted. It's a slightly unusual technique. It's initially done with Danish oil and then it's overcoated with the old Birchwood KC True Oil. It gives an incredibly robust finish. It's easy to maintain, and for guns that are out in the worst of the weather, it really works well. So let's get stuck in. You've just seen that I've sanded this to 320 grit. I always use sponge back, so all I started with was 120. On the orbital sander, great. I always do the final sand in the 320 after I've done some of it on the orbital. I always go back over that by hand, as you've seen. Now, the most important part after that, I've just had a silver Scotch-Brite pad on the orbital sander. You want to be very careful to try and get as much of the dust out of the grain as you physically can. That will make the finished piece that much smoother, that much brighter. If there's bits of dust left in the grain, you'll tend to find that you get dull spots. Now, if you've got a nice bit of bright red laminate, that's going to look terrible. So you need to just take that bit of extra time to give it a really good clean up. I will be using Danish oil to start with. I'll do possibly 3 or 4 coats of that to start with to fully seal and penetrate into the wood fibres. And then once we've finished with the Danish oil, I'll then go on to doing some top coats in the old Birchwood KC True Oil. Now, the True Oil, I don't really like to put that straight onto fresh laminate. Even when you thin that down, it never seems to draw in quite as well as the Danish does. So the Danish will do the most of the sealing up to start with, and then the True Oil will just be used primarily as a surface coat on top of that. And again, we'll maybe do 3 or 4 coats of the True Oil down the line. So that can go for the moment because we won't need that just yet. I've only sanded these at the moment to 320 grit with a sponge backed sandpaper. You don't need to go any finer than that. If you start going much finer than that, you will actually find that the oil won't draw into the wood as well as it could do. So stick to 320. We will, going through the coats, we will actually give it a buff off between coats with some finer grit. So I've got some 1200 grit here, and even some 2000 grit, and I've also got some silver Scotch-Brite pad, this sort of stuff as well. The key things with this really is not to panic, not to rush it, and if you do get an unsightly run that you miss, let it dry and then come back to it and sand it off. Remove it with a scalpel blade if you have to, if it's a big bead of True Oil. The worst thing you can do is come back to it when it's partially dry and attempt to remove it then. You'll end up with a sticky mess and it won't go to plan. So you also then need to have something to support your work pieces while you're oiling them. So I've just got a scrap board here. I use loads of these little aluminium pins, posts that I've made, whatever you want to call them. Once the pieces are oiled, I can stand them on the board, and if I need to get them up to the light, work the oil in, I can also hold the little post it's on. So it's a good idea to have a close but loose fitting post in your board so you can manipulate it, get it up to the light. You don't really want to go and sit this on a radiator or anything like that. Somewhere warm, probably out of direct sunlight, is a good idea too, but really whatever you do, don't just go and sit this on a radiator, because you just don't want that. Certainly at the later stages when we're using the True Oil, we don't want it to skin over too quickly, because that can lead to a world of trouble. So we want that to dry at a fairly ambient temperature, not too hot, not too cold really. So indoors, on the kitchen table, when the wife's out, whatever. That's Rustin's Danish oil. Any good quality Danish oil will do the job. Always give it a good shake. I'll decant that into a separate tub and I'll stick that out of the way. This is quite an important bit. I don't ever do any of this oiling nowadays without nitrile gloves on. They need to be nitrile as well. If you try and do this with a PVC glove or whatever them little clear ones are, they can melt with some of the oil. So a nitrile glove, be it blue, black, orange, they're all the same. But what it'll allow me to do, look, I'm absolutely going to saturate this. Got a little cotton bud here as well if I've got any little nooks and crannies to get into. If you've got any counter bores to get into in your bolt holes, a little cotton bud's great to get down into any of these areas. You're likely to spill some of your oil, so it's probably a good idea if you're doing this indoors to get some newspaper down, or at least have a work mat down or something like that. So for the moment I'm just giving it a really good soak in. It's quite wet at the moment. Away for a second. You can see already the colour change as it starts running. You can see, I don't know, well hopefully you can see that it's starting to absorb in the end grain areas. It draws in quite quick, so we'll keep going back to these and we'll keep feeding as much oil into this as we physically can do for the moment. So while I'm working on the other pieces, the grip itself, it's absorbing in. If you're working on a stock, a full stock for instance, just keep working it. Ideally you want to keep each piece fairly well saturated for probably the best part of 10 minutes as a minimum before we consider wiping any of it off. So I'll probably pause it in a minute once I've got this on, grab a cup of tea and come back. And see already I've spilt some, so it doesn't matter out in the shed here, but if you're doing this indoors, obviously if you are indoors you want a decent bit of ventilation as well, because this stuff stinks. If you've got something unusually shaped like this cheek piece, I've actually just put a hole in a concealed area. This is going to be the underside of the cheek. I've just popped a hole in purely to allow me to pop it on my little drying peg. And the reason I do this with the Danish oil and the true oil is that although the Danish gives a very good finish, it's not actually that robust, especially for competition guns. We've been out on courses before with guns that are finished just in Danish, and if you've got a wet shooting glove with a bit of mud, a bit of dirt on it, you can wear through that Danish oil finish quite quickly. Some of the conditions that we've shot competition, no sane individual would normally be out pest controlling or anything in that sort of weather, but when you've driven halfway across the country, of course, you're going to shoot regardless of what the weather's doing. So this is a finish, a technique to get a decent finish that I've been evolving for, I don't even know how long now. I've been evolving it for years, but it works incredibly well. And the most important thing with this is, should you get a ding or a bash in it, it's incredibly easy to come back and maintain it. Right, so you can see this grip, I've gone back to that and just given it another fairly wet coat on there. And I'll do the same again to that hamster. Because there's more face grain on it, this is mostly end grain, so it'll absorb more oil into the grip than the hamster will do. But the end of the hamster, hopefully you can see that, the front end and the back end here will absorb more than the sides and the top edges will do. You can see I'm working fairly quickly with it, working it in quite hard. Right, so still absolutely slapping that on. Again, pay good attention to the end grain areas. Maybe you can see here, look, that it's absorbed in quite a lot more already onto the end grain. So give that a good rub in. If it needs any more, great. Right, what I'm going to do, I'm going to pop this down for the moment. I'm going to pop you on pause. I'm going to give these 10 minutes and I'm going to come back to them. You can see that that oil's drawn in quite well. Got a few little patchy bits, that's fine at this stage. Now I'm going to give it another reasonably wet coat, so just going to get a few little dobs on there and work it in, and I'll just keep working it in until it's fairly dry again. So I'll do that now. So not quite as wet this time as the first coat that went on. I really want to work that into all of the grain. Some of you will have noticed that I haven't wet this laminate down and raised the grain. Now, if this was a wall hanger, if it was a showpiece, I definitely would have raised the grain. So I would have given it a good wipe over with a damp cloth, let it all go fuzzy, and what that does is raises up any of the low spots in the grain itself. Now that's great if it's something to show off, if it's a range toy, if it's not going to be out in the weather, but when you consider that you raise the grain on some of this and flat it off, maybe say 10% of your surface of the actual grip or your stock is then going to be quite a lot softer than the rest of it. So over the years I've stopped raising the grain on competition guns and stuff that's going to be used in competition primarily, and actually then build up more coats of oil to fill the grain. Of course you will still see some more of the actual wood grain. It won't be like glass initially. You can add more coats of true oil down the line and you can buff that back as you go, and you can get a few coats on, flat it back with 2000 grit, go back over the top, and of course in time that'll eventually fill the grain up and it will be beautifully smooth. But that's not really the sort of finish that we need. We don't want a finish like that on the comp guns. We just need something that's super robust and easily maintained, because these are going to get battered. That's getting quite hot. I like to go sort of across the grain at a little bit of an angle. So that tacky oil, I'm sort of working it into the grain itself. This is where it's handy to have a little post, because I can put that on the post and I can rub that in so I've got no fingerprints in it, and then it can stay there to dry for the moment. So in total this will have stayed fairly wet for probably 15 minutes or so. You don't necessarily want to keep it saturated any longer than that. Call the old hands are sore. Right, that's good. That's absorbing in quite well. Right, I'm going to leave that for another 10 minutes and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to cloth off and give them a chance then to sit overnight, and we'll come back to it tomorrow and get the next bits done. So I'm rubbing that off, but as you can see I'm going across the grain slightly at a slight angle, so any of that tacky oil that's still on the surface has now been worked into the grain itself. It doesn't get any easier the more often you do this, I'll tell you that much. Right, before you set that aside, get it on your peg, get it up to the light and make sure that there's no obvious lumps, bumps, fingerprints, anything like that. Looks good, and surprisingly no obvious blemishes, but we'll go back over these once they're fully dry tomorrow and have a look. Right, don't put that down on there, let's put that back in the bottle. When you've got oily cloths, it's always best to store them safely. They normally go back in a sealed bag, so apparently these can set on fire or whatever, but I've been doing this a long time, yet to see it happen. Be quite interested to know if anyone's actually seen it happen, but don't forget your safety squints and all that lark. Right, I'll catch up with you tomorrow, guys. Right guys, I'm back. It's 20 hours later and they're looking fantastic. We've got a nice matte finish on them. There's actually, I can't see a little blemish on here at all, but if you have got any bits of fluff stuck in here from your cloth, if there's any loose bits of grain, now's the time to attack them with a bit of 800 grit, maybe 1200 depending on what you've got there, but basically you can just attempt to give it a little gentle buff back, bring it back smooth, and then just slap on a good dollop of oil as we did yesterday, and then work it back in, let it partially dry, and then wipe it off with a cloth. Obviously that will set you back a little bit with your timings, but you need to really take out any blemishes as early as you can, and obviously that will mean that you can then do full coats after that and you haven't got any little bits to come back and worry about. So the first thing we're going to do now, a bit more Danish in the tub, And we're going to give them all a quick wipe over with a relatively wet coat. I'm not going to absolutely slap it on, but a couple of dips in there. Just work it into the grain. Again, pay attention to the end grain. Right, so once these have got just a light wet coat on, I'll give them just 5 minutes to sit. And this is 1200 grit I've got here. What I'm going to do is just work it back over the grips. As I do when I rub the oil into it, go slightly across the grain. And what it will do is it will start picking this up and it will start working the oil as it dries into the grain, and it starts to grain fill it slightly. Right, I've literally just given that a few minutes. So 1200 grit, 1500 grit, 2000 grit, anything that sort of fine will be absolutely fine. So just going to give this a really gentle rub across the grain. You don't want to be too aggressive with it at all. And what this is going to do is start lifting up some of the top of that first coat and this oil here, and it's going to make almost a bit of a sludge, almost as if you was working with walnut and grain filling, but you need to be very, very gentle. You'll find that it starts to dry quite quickly like this, and if it does, just have another little dab on there, just so it stays lightly damp. Right, then give it a really good work in. Again, across the grain slightly. Right, now take your little stick, get it up to the light, and just make sure that you've got no obvious lumps, bumps, fingerprints, or anything like that. And you will start noticing now that it looks an awful lot smoother as the grain starts to feel slightly. I probably won't film it, but I'm going to do exactly the same as what we're doing here today. I'm going to do exactly the same again tomorrow, and I'll probably come back to you once I've done that. It's quite warm out here today, so this is drying quite quick, so I've been careful to keep it quite damp. Once I've done that hamster, I'll give it another 10 minutes. It should have dried quite well by then, so it will look fairly dry. But then I'm going to give it a cloth off again to satin it up. If you're working with fresh laminate and it's the spring like this, you're going to find that that oil is going to draw in over the coming weeks. Once that true oil goes on, you'll get a lovely finish, but you'll notice after 2, 3, 4 weeks, especially if it's a spring and it starts to warm up a bit, that you're going to want to go back over it. It's completely normal. It sort of shrinks back into it, and you'll notice that you start to see some of your grain appearing again. So don't panic if that happens. That's completely normal. Just simply go back over it with the Scotch-Brite, but we'll cover that when we get to that as well again. Again, going slightly against the grain, or across the grain should I say. So instead of raising the grain, we've partially filled it with the oil. It makes it a much more robust finish, especially where the guns are likely to get battered. That looks mega. You should be under no illusion, guys, that this is hard work. You can't rush it. If you try and rush it, you'll end up with a sticky mess. But the results are definitely worth just taking that bit of time, especially if you've got a decent bit of woodwork. You could always slap a couple of coats of lacquer on the fresh laminate, but it's very much a shortcut. While it's intact, it's fine, but the minute you get a ding or a bash in it, unless you're incredibly familiar on repairing lacquer and things like that, you're in a world of trouble. And also, if you get damage whilst you're out on a course, you can't then go and stick a dab of oil on it and wipe it in to keep you going. So oil for me is the only way to do it nowadays. If I was to lacquer these, I could have had them lacquered and out the door by now. They'll look nice for a little while, but shortly after, it won't look so good. Oh, don't spin around. I'll be back to you the day after tomorrow and we'll start on the true oiling. You can see it's starting to pick up a little bit of a shine to it now. When they're a bit drier, I'll take them outside and get a picture in some decent daylight for you, but as it goes, that looks flipping awesome. Right, I'll catch up with you in 2 days' time. Got my gloves back on. With the true oil, when you've got gloves on, when we start working that oil into it, we'll actually be putting on a slightly thicker coat than you can do either with a cloth or with a bare hand. It will only be microns thicker, and certainly you've got to be very careful with the true oil. You don't want to slap it on too thickly. It will take a bit of practice to get used to, but the trick with the true oil is not to overwork it. Once it starts to cure and once it starts to go off, you really need to then set it aside and wait until it's dry. Often people will get in there with Scotch-Brite or wire wool when it's sort of tacky and work it in like I did with the Danish oil. Now, in my experience, that's not particularly wise because I've seen it before and it never seems to dry particularly well. So always, if you make a mistake or anything like that, let it dry first and then come back to it. So the first thing I'm going to do with these now, so this has had the 4 coats of Danish as you've seen so far. I'm going to buff them off that silver Scotch-Brite. I'm just going to give these a quick abrade over, going in little circles just to give this surface a little key up. Quite gently, nothing too aggressive. Don't forget to get into all the bits you can't normally see. Any areas that might hold moisture or anything like that, make sure you give them a good prep as well, because actually they're the bits that can really be problematic down the line. If you've got bits of an inlet inside a stock that holds moisture, you really need to make sure that you get a decent oil finish in there to stop any moisture ingress into the wood itself. Right, dust off. I'll get through a lot of this, buy it in the great big bottles. Right, tip of the old finger in the true oil, just a few little gentle dobs, a bit like you'd be applying polish to your car. Make sure you're getting all the little gaps. Right, this is where having these little, because I can rub off the bottom there so that's nice and flat. Pop my post in and now I can support that and get around the whole of the grip. Posts come in really handy. It's not too warm out in the shed today, so this isn't going to start curing quite as quickly as it would do on a hot day. But
that's gone on quite thinly, so that looks pretty good for the first coat.
We still want to pay attention to see I'm rubbing against the grain slightly, or across the grain slightly, just to work it in. The grain is fairly well filled from the Danish, but just get it up against the light. Looks good. I'll probably do this 3 or 4 times, and each time between the coats I'm going to give it a really light buff back with that Scotch-Brite. They're looking fantastic. That's just after the first coat of true oil, so same again, quick scuff up with the old Scotch-Brite.
Alright, catch up with you tomorrow.
That grain is really quite well filled, so I think for the moment maybe just 1 more coat of true oil and these would be good to go, I reckon. Yeah, they look nice. Right, I'm giving them a bit more of a vigorous rub this time and key them up really well. When you're finished with your oiling, There's no reason why, if you don't want it a high gloss finish, you can always knock that shine off with a gentle buff with the old Scotch-Brite, and it will give it a bit more of a satin finish to it.
Don't know if you better see that, but obviously I've just given it a scuff up now, but that end grain is almost completely filled. That looks mega.
There really are no shortcuts to getting a decent oil finish, guys. You really do need to just pay really good attention to the prep work, and the prep work is really the most important part of this, and then just not rushing through the oil, making sure that you allow it to dry fully before going back with the finishing coats. If this hadn't dried properly and we buffed it back, you may well find that you start to expose uncured oil underneath. You put the next coat on and it'll just end up as a sticky mess. It seems to be quite a common theme where people struggle with true oil, but if you just take your time, let it dry between coats, you can't really go too far wrong, as long as you don't attack it when it's not cured properly. Right, so exactly the same process as last time with the true oil. Oh, that looks lovely. Spread that around evenly and don't hang around. As long as you're fast with this, if it goes on slightly thicker than you want, it's not necessarily a problem, but you just need to be super careful that you don't leave any big fingerprints in, and just let it dry before you attempt to do anything with it. Oh, it's getting hot. If up until this stage you've got everything right and the prep work was decent, you don't even need to thin down them finished coats. You can do that straight out of the bottle with your gloves on like this. I won't bother thinning it down for a final coat or anything like that. It's unnecessary if you've got your technique dialed. And you do it like this. It saves a bit of faffing around, and also a thinned down coat can take sometimes 2 or 3 days to dry if you're not careful. Always put the coats just a fraction thicker on the hamsters, because they end up getting bashed up a little bit more. I do think that that's probably about where they want to be at the moment. The true oil protection takes a little while to cure. It's dry within 24 hours, but it doesn't fully cure for sometimes a fortnight. I mean, it's still safe to use after 24 hours, but it doesn't fully cure for a little while after that. And you will find down the line that the oil itself will sort of shrink back a little bit, and then it will just be a case of periodically giving it a going over with the old Scotch-Brite, just to take off any high spots, sort of check for any damage, and then a couple of fresh coats of true oil. I normally do my comp guns usually only 3 times a year. Will I actually give them a good going over, and that seems to be, with a finish like this, that's about the sort of regularity you need to do it. It's not something you need to be doing very often, so super robust, nice and easy to maintain, and if you do get any damage, it's incredibly easy to patch this back in again. But I think for the moment this set would probably call that good, so I'll get some nice pictures once they're dry. I'll see you in the next one, guys.